Okay, I'm glad to be back here with Philosophicat again. This time we are going to discuss Atlantis. So last year, December 2nd, Philosophicat put out a video about Atlantis that I didn't know about. So it didn't show up on my feed. And then 3 days later, December 5th, I made one of my recent Atlantis videos and started getting back into the Atlantis study stuff. And then like 2 weeks later, I realized that Philosophicat had made that video, which is kind of interesting. Now today, when we were scheduled to record this talk about Atlantis, Edward Dutton puts out a video saying that the Greek in Plato's account indicates that Atlantis was not real. Now, if Atlantis wasn't real, then how could it cause synchronicities like that? So I bet Ed's feeling very silly right now, but so this is going to be relatively casual. I mean, the people on my channel have heard my basic take on Atlantis. I tend towards the kind of archaeological evidence and recently genetic evidence and kind of building a hypothesis without taking the entirety of Plato's account as gospel, although clearly Plato's account is one of the most important sources we have. Philosophicat has also followed some of those sources. I know she's interested in like Graham Hancock and that sort of thing. But coming from her background in Evola traditionalism, kind of spirituality more generally, I think we could have an interesting discussion about the implications of Atlantis. So to start with, I guess just for the audience, how did you get interested in Atlantis? Why is that a topic that attracted your attention?
I think I was just born interested in Atlantis, to be honest. I remember, like, as a kid, there would be, like, these documentary shows on TV in the summer times of them going out and, like, digging around in the Bermuda Triangle looking for evidence of Atlantis. And if a program like that came on, I did not care what was going on outside. I was inside watching that TV, taking it all in. And then every time I would be so disappointed that at the end they admitted that they actually didn't know anything further about Atlantis. I'm like, what a gem. So I've always kind of been interested in it, but I've started to look more into it, obviously, just as part of other esoteric and mythological studies. Since it's the idea of a disappearing island is a theme that comes up a lot in myth. So it's kind of like, all right, well, maybe this merits some further investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of the Western Isles of the Blessed also comes up in a number of world mythologies, especially the Greek. So as far as Plato's account and the timing there, the elephant in the room is the similarity of the timeline that Plato describes and the Younger Dryas event and sort of the beginning of Holocene, civilized humanity as we know it. It's hard to explain how Plato has this knowledge. Edward Dutton pointed to these specific terms in the Greek that indicated doubt about the story. And I'm 100% sure that Plato did have doubt about it. But I also believe, just from Plato's writing, that when Plato presents a myth, there is something true about it. He doesn't waste words. That's for sure. So in Plato's account, he describes events similar to the war against Persia, right? Athens kind of holds back this tide, the tyrannical advancing civilization, but this time it's flipped, from the Atlantic rather than from Asia. So it is understandable to sort of cast doubt on the whole narrative, saying he's just taking recent events in Greek history and recasting them in order to talk about, his idealized perfect society. That really, again, can't be maintained when you look at the parallels between the actual history we know about and the events Plato describes. So I recommended to Philosophicat a few months ago, I don't know if you got to read it, but this book by Mary Sedegast, Plato Prehistorian. Did you get a chance to check that out at all?
I didn't get to, no, unfortunately.
Okay. Not a big deal. But anyway, she describes the parallels between changes in the archaeological record within the Mediterranean and the timeline of Plato's war. So basically, on both sides, in the European side and the African side of the Mediterranean, you see a shift from kind of more elaborate artistic traditions to a more simple and like materialistic tradition. You see arrowheads, microliths replacing these kind of, you know, larger, more beautiful tools that they had previously. And that does go all the way up to Italy and all the way across North Africa to Egypt, just as Plato describes. Of course, we also see the kind of collapse of the old Gravettian culture, which was still kind of around, even though you had the rise of the Magdalenians. So there are these big demographic shifts. There are shifts in toolmaking technology consistent with this account of a war. Another interesting parallel, just to give some like historical credence to what Plato is talking about. Another interesting parallel, the way that Plato describes the Guardian Society in the Republic, and of course the ancient Athens described in the Timaeus and Critias. Ancient Athens operated according to a constitution just like that described in the Republic. So the Guardians didn't have individual families. They sort of thought of each other all as kin. The nuclear family didn't exist. Now, Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest cities in the world, probably the earliest city in south-central Anatolia, they've done dental analysis and genetic analysis of the different kind of houses within this compound. And it seems like a similar sort of thing was going on in a similar time frame as Plato describes, so a couple thousand years later, but there is evidence of the same genetic stock that would have been in Athens in ancient times, the Anatolian hunter-gatherer stock, having a similar kind of unconventional reproductive strategy. There are some other, you know, specific historical details, but I think taken as a whole, you know, there are things that make you wonder whether there wasn't some real advanced civilization. So what are some of those data points? Let's start with that make you, you know, question whether Atlantis was real.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously have a much greater knowledge in regards to the archaeology and the anthropology than I do, so I'll probably defer to you on those points. It's not a huge area of interest for me. I kind of just look at, you know, like the way Graham Hancock lays it out. His premise is basically like, look at all these ancient sites around the world that we really have no explanation for, that appear to have predated the cultures that we attribute them to. And then we see a technological decline. Like they can't build these things anymore. These all raise a lot of questions in my mind, and I think it's, you know, it merits further study. Unfortunately, you know, science is kind of preferred to sort of quietly close the door on these lines of inquiries. But we can't really ignore the fact that there is a lot of mythological evidence for it, and there also does actually seem to be some physical evidence in the form of all these ancient ruins that predate the earliest peoples known to have lived in the regions where they've been found. Like if somebody's watched the Ancient Apocalypse series on Netflix with Graham Hancock, one of the places he talks about is this site in Malta. And it's just like, but, you know, modern archaeology and anthropology says there weren't people here at the time that this appears to have been built based on, you know, the astrological alignments. And we see these astrological alignments in all of these sites. So, you know, clearly it was important. I do disagree with a lot of Graham Hancock and the new archaeology school, where they're just kind of like, oh, they were just counting down to the next cataclysm. I don't really think that's what it was about at all. But clearly this was a feature in these societies, and it's worth noting. It's worth noting these similarities, and we can sort of use it to kind of date these sites. But, you know, if there was this advanced civilization, of course, then it turns everything we know about human history on its head. And more importantly, it turns that modern narrative of progress on its head, and calls into question our origins. So
Right.
these are kind of the questions that kind of enter into my mind. And I'm happy to let other people sort of dig into like the genetics and the timelines and things like that. From my perspective, I'm more like, whether it's true or not, almost like if it's literally true or not, almost doesn't matter as much as the fact that it's allegorically true. It's mythologically true. And that's where the greatest value in it lies, not in this, you know, kind of running around like tinkers collecting as many shiny objects as we can and being like, oh, we found another rock on the Bimini Road. Oh, they must have had spaceships. It's like, it's like, it's interesting, but there's not a lot of like substance to that kind of digging. That said, the stuff that you've looked into, and I've watched your recent videos on all of the genetic evidence that you've been putting together, it seems like you've really kind of dived into this topic and traced all of these like different haplogroups and things like that, which is very interesting, but definitely not my wheelhouse. And using that, you can kind of construct a sort of timeline and be like, well, does this line up? And if it does line up, then it adds extra credence to this. It does speak to something in our origins that is probably true. And it's much harder for people then to just dismiss it as, oh, that's just a myth. That myths aren't true, which is what the modern mind obviously thinks about myth. So given that we live in this kind of like very empirical, rationalist, evidence-based society, for that reason alone, it's worthwhile to, try to gather up as much of this evidence and build a case for it as we can. But I'm more of like, okay, well, I believe it was probably true. That's good enough for me. I'm going to focus on the, the spiritual significance of it and what it has to say about the transcendent quest of man.
Right. Yeah. The relation between myth time and historical time is questionable. In my own system of philosophy, I leave open the possibility that, in fact, I'm pretty sure that the past itself is not fixed. That time being at some level illusory, we, by our actions here and by the information we have available to us psychically, we, in a way, construct our own past. So even if Plato didn't believe it was true at the time, according to my system of thinking, he very well could have summoned the historical Atlantis into being by writing about it. Now, I would have to go in.
How so? Why do you think that?
So, yeah, we'll have to dip into like my system of philosophy for a minute. I have one core thought that's original to me, which is the idea that if the cosmos is infinite and we are finite, we don't exist in one location in the infinite cosmos. Because any finite identity in an infinite world fits in that infinite world in many different ways. So rather than there being like one big universe and we're like you are here, instead we're surrounded by a cloud of consistent contexts. That applies to our past, our future, and I think it explains actually quantum mechanical effects. Why is there this probability cloud, the wave function, and whatnot? So in light of that, the evidence that we interact with collapses the wave function of the past, but also our action and the stories that we tell collapse that wave function in their own way. Every thought in our minds collapses the realm of possibility to some degree. Similar to ideas in like As a Man Thinketh, which is one of these popular like spiritualist books from the early 20th century. I actually really recommend that book if people haven't checked it out. But yeah, this is not a totally radical idea that we construct our reality at some level. Thought constructs the reality that we perceive. But going back to the like actual historical points that you mentioned, it's hard to deny that in the Incan civilization, you see the large megalithic constructions with no gaps, no mortar, these kind of perfect architectural marvels situated sometimes like on rock cliffs. Like, how did they even get stones up there? And then on top of that, you see this kind of like cobblestone, really shoddy looking work. The same kind of thing happens with Göbekli Tepe, where the very earliest layers of Göbekli Tepe, you have the largest stones and the most sophisticated artwork. Okay, if this is hunter-gatherers just like surviving this Younger Dryas catastrophe, why immediately are they so much more sophisticated, and then why does that decline for several thousand years? Göbekli Tepe is the largest megalithic structure for several thousand years after it was built. Similar to the way that like the pyramids are the largest structure on Earth until like the 1800s. So, yeah, that's one of those points that makes you wonder, okay, what did the ancients know that allowed them to do this? Now, I guess one
Well,
last
and I,
point.
I think
Yeah, go
that's
ahead.
kind of also something that that modern academia isn't even willing to consider. They can't really conceive, like they operate from a premise that the world in the past has the same conditions as the world of today, and they don't allow for the fact that, well, maybe ancient peoples were superior and had a different kind of technology that we can't even conceive of, a spiritual technology, for example, which, the modern mind is just like, oh, what, like psychically moving blocks into place with sound vibrations or whatever. It's like, well, maybe, like, we don't have the capacity to even conceive of that because we don't live in that world where that could have even been possible, and we don't know what would have been possible for these people. They were not the same kind of people as us. We're in a much more fallen state.
Right. Yeah, there's a channel, I think it's Uncharted X on YouTube. He looks into all of these advanced artifacts from Egypt, and it looks like, you have precision machining in some of these early artifacts, like stone vases, stone vessels of various shapes that are perfectly symmetrical. I mean, he analyzes them using modern machines, and I mean, he challenges anyone using modern technology to even replicate some of these things. That and
Yeah.
larger megalithic constructions that the later Egyptians somehow lost the ability to do, you know.
Yeah, and
Um,
we're kind of, we have to consider also in the traditional world, artisan guilds were a thing. They all had their secret sciences that related to their professions, like the stonemasons and whatnot. Um, but I came across a quote, I want to say from Joseph de Maistre, where he essentially said that in prehistoric ancient times that there was a very different science that originated, from above and was very dangerous. It was confined to the temples, but it eventually then became extinct when the only thing that the flame could do was burn. And it's really interesting to consider that in light of all of these, these myths around like the cataclysm and stuff. One of which is can be linked to the myth of Phaeton's little joyride through the heavens, where he scorched the earth, and then of course Zeus had to send the flood to put it out, saving only a handful of people, to for his little age of heroes. And it's interesting, this idea that, maybe there was this spiritual science, this flame, which is, so frequently associated with the solar spirituality that's linked to Atlantis, to Hyperborea. And once we lost the ability to control that, or perhaps misused it, Manly P. Hall kind of just makes a very off the cuff comment in one of his books that Atlantis was destroyed because of black magic, and says it in this very matter of fact way that this is just common knowledge, which does seem like it could have been likely. There are references to certain things like that. But once you misuse a power like that, or you don't have the spiritual fortitude to control it, then yes, all it would do is burn. And of course, then who wants to use it? So now we don't have that anymore, and we don't even really know what it was.
right. Yeah, on that front, I'm a big believer in the sound-based technology aspect. I don't know
Same.
if you found these South African singing stone videos on YouTube.
No.
So there were advanced cultures in South Africa in historical times, from India, in fact. So associated with some of these sites that people say are from this Indian South African civilization are these stones that somehow like grow what looks like a rough outer surface, but if you chip that away, there's this like crystalline core that if you strike it vibrates and sings. This is one of these, you can only find like a fringe YouTube videos about it. You can't find legitimate references about it.
Well,
But yeah, that's
nobody wants to study this. They can't explain it. And, modern man is so arrogant that if something is outside of his ability to explain, he would rather just ignore it than admit he doesn't know.
right. Yeah, but music, I mean, in Greek philosophy, music theory was really the foundation of modern science as we know it. I mean, Pythagoras, who made all these innovations in mathematics, like the innovation, the discovery that got him started was recognizing the ratios inherent in the basic musical intervals. Like the octave, of course, is one against two. wavelengths. The perfect fifth is 2 against 3. The perfect fourth is 4 against 3. So these sorts of discoveries. And there's also, I don't know if you've kind of run into this idea in your reading in spirituality, but the idea that perfect fifths kind of spiral around and don't actually land back perfectly at an octave. So if you take 12 perfect fifths, you go up 7 octaves, but the octave is just slightly off. And this, reminds me of the fall in the Bible, the idea of a decline from like a more perfect, ordered state of things that Plato describes in The Statesman. So in The Statesman, Plato says that in the past, the stars actually rotated the other way, and Kronos was directly guiding affairs. So there are these alternating periods in the cosmos at large where you have like divine guidance, and then the divine guidance backs off, and you kind of run it back the other way as if the universe is this big clock. And one of the signs of the degenerated cosmos is this like not quite aligning incommensurability that appears in music and a bunch of other things. So it may not simply be that we can't like mentally achieve what the Atlanteans did, but it could be that the order of the cosmos was at some level just fundamentally different. And what we have access to with our sounds is based on a kind of corrupted music theory where we have this incommensurability. So that's a very far out speculation.
I think you might be onto something there, just because, it says in the Vedas that essentially, like, as we get into the Kali Yuga, first of all, like time moves faster, but also we're falling deeper into like solidification, which is, people might get the wrong idea of that because solidification kind of sounds like it's implying like this really fixed static state, but that's the opposite. That fixed static nature is, the realm of being, the golden age, whereas this descent is coming more into matter, into this state of chaos and quantum flux. And as we get deeper into the Kali Yuga, matter is essentially like becoming more unstable, even at the atomic level. Like this is kind of the principle of entropy, essentially. And so the ability to do magic, to work these spiritual sciences becomes more and more difficult, to the point that, we, like, for the vast majority of humanity, we have no hope of even being able to approach it. I mean, maybe somebody who's really spiritually advanced and knows about this stuff could potentially do it. But I think, what you're saying about like the octave not quite coming back to where it was, like, yeah, maybe there's some form of corruption that has happened that's affected. Of course, it would affect everything, including the music.
Right. Yeah. It's also interesting, just sticking on that music theme, that the rise of like advanced Upper Paleolithic activity coincides with the emergence of the first musical instruments in the archaeological record. Part of my Atlantis theory involves the Carpathian Sphinx. I don't know if people know about this, but there is this, it looks like a statue of a human head, quite large, in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania.
I didn't know about this. Cool.
This was in my very first Atlantis video from like 7 or 8 years ago. But the geologists say this is a natural rock formation. However, there is strong evidence of constant human contact with this rock. So it may be something where the Neanderthals who were there kind of marveling at this thing just couldn't help themselves from touching it, and gradually they kind of formed it more in the shape of a human head. But this valley that this Carpathian Sphinx is situated in also has, it's a high mountain valley, by the way, also has like natural stages. It has caves with really powerful acoustical properties. One of my friends from the Plato reading groups that I do was in Romania recently, and he said he was in that region around the Sphinx, and he gets this very like powerful energy from that location. And I also put stock in that idea that there are particular locations, very specific spots on the Earth that radiate a certain sort of energy, and advanced civilizations and even new racial stocks emanate from a particular spot on the Earth for a reason. So Atlantis would be one of these places. The Carpathian Mountains seems to be one of these locations because this is where the Gravettian culture first originates. And I think actually a few other later European upper Paleolithic cultures also emanate from that same location. Wherever you have depressions as well, like the Afar Depression in Ethiopia, doing physical anthropology research, I noticed that a lot of different species, archaic species, originated in the Afar Depression. There's also in Israel, I forget what it's called, but there is, geologically speaking, one of these big depression zones, which just means there's less stuff between you and the core of the Earth, so I would imagine that would lead to some kind of energy coming through. With Atlantis, the case would be far stronger because if the Azores location of the Atlantis is correct, basically as Plato seems to describe it, that's the school of thought I hold to, that's what Randall Carlson believes, that island would have been at the center of 3 diverging continental plates: the North American plate, the European plate, and the African plate. So definitely that is geologically a significant spot. Also, if you trace back the drift of the continents, the last time, I don't think it was Pangaea, but the last supercontinent had Atlantis basically at its core. So that's an interesting anecdote. Have you run into other kind of spiritualist thoughts on that subject? Are there particular locations on the Earth that have a certain energy? Also, I kind of drifted from the music point. I'd like to get back to that eventually. Okay. But anyway, yeah.
We can circle back. I agree with you on that. Mircea Eliade writes about this in The Sacred and the Profane, this idea that there are certain places that are more sacred, and modern man, of course, has no sensibility to detect this. To modern man, he could be walking through a gate to heaven or a portal to hell, and they would both feel exactly the same to him. It's just another day strolling down his neighborhood, right? But of course, sacred man does not exist just in the profane world. He also exists in the sacred realm. And so there are these different locations, which are often, geographically or astronomically significant in some way. You wouldn't construct a new settlement, for example, without first kind of consulting the stars and making sure it was on the right spot, because this was to do this was almost a religious act to put down roots somewhere. And as for just kind of where Atlantis might have been, I mean, there's a million and one theories, and of course, I don't know that we can ever definitively prove it, but it does sound like Atlantis was a colonial power, probably had multiple locations. All of these main cities would have been constructed in the same way with the same rationale. So I think you could make a case that, you could probably find multiples of these settlements as different migrations and waves happened, different evidence that's equally strong for, I know a lot of people really like the reshot in the Sahara, and the Azores, of course, is a popular one too. Or some people are like, no, it was Doggerland. No, it's Antarctica, or it's whatever, right? It's in the Bermuda Triangle. Well, it could have had locations and populations in all of those places. I don't think it was just one tiny little city-state. We're talking about, even if it wasn't an actual continent, even if it is just a series of islands, it's pretty clear that this was a naval power. They're a seafaring people. So having multiple island locations seems, perfectly consistent with that. They don't seem to be the kind of people who are dwelling very far inland. And, at least in the later incarnation of Atlantis, because there seems to have been 2 Atlantises, one which is much older, but in this Bronze Age Atlantis to which Plato is referring to, they seem like a pretty warlike population, which Evola kind of relates to the sort of Titanic revolt.
When you say Bronze Age Atlantis, are you referring to the orichalcum that is described, or what do you mean?
More in terms of Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, the sort of spiritual epics.
Right, but that wouldn't be coincident with the archaeological Bronze Age.
No, it's not the archaeological Bronze Age. It is a bit of a confusion there.
Okay, right.
I mean, and there's a lot of confusion in talking about Atlantis in general, because I mean, a lot of the symbolism of Atlantis is either confused with like Hyperborean symbolism, or it's got a lot of like cultural trappings from a particular region grafted onto it, or there's elements coming up from these southern strains of spirituality that weren't native to Atlantis but still became adopted and integrated into it. You know, what's the difference between the Silver Age Atlantis versus the Bronze Age Atlantis? And so it can be quite an effort to sort of like untangle all of this in a meaningful way and then pin it to a chronological timeline.
Right.
And that's part of why I don't do it, because it's just like, it's too much to think about.
Yeah, none of these things are certain. I have tried, though, to put my own kind of timeline together, and I agree with what you said with the two Atlantises. Are there any particular sources that you've seen that address this, or where are you getting this idea of the kind of two Atlantises from?
Okay, well, Miguel Serrano makes a reference to two Atlantises, and then I started to look more deeply into this. I'm like, okay, because he talks about an Atlantis that more or less lines up with this Younger Dryas comet timeline, but then also one that's much, much older. I'm like, all right, well, maybe there's some merit to this that might explain some discrepancies and such that I've come across. And of course, then in Revolt Against the Modern World, we have a whole chapter on, let me just see what the name of the chapter is. The Cycles of Decadence and the Heroic Cycle is the chapter. And in it, we have this nice little handy diagram here on page 229, where he's basically breaking down. So first of all, we've got the Arctic cycle, the Hyperborean cycle of the Golden Age, this divine regality before, you know, the dualism of masculine feminine enters the picture. And then of course we have the fall, and now we have a split of men and women. And now every age after this is characterized by the relative relationship between the masculine and the feminine. What flavor is it taking on? Which one is kind of more dominant? And so he then says, all right, Silver Age becomes this, the first Atlantis is a colonial seat, a reproduction of the Hyperborean seat. But it descends into this sort of like priestly gynocracy, and this there's an attempt to sort of reinstate this lunar principle against a masculine revolt that then occurs, and then they end up losing that spiritual element that had originally established this dignity of the Demetrian principle. That principle of like the woman kind of coming in and having any kind of authority at all, this is very new. And you start to see things like the cult of the mother come up, which comes in from, you know, the southern Lemurian remnants that they were interacting with. And because of this, we then get into the sort of like the third age, the Bronze Age, the mythological Bronze Age. And we have simultaneously occurring the rise of Amazonism, as well as this sort of titanic revolt of the warrior class against this degraded priestly caste. And this is what Evola is saying is like the second Atlantis that more or less lines up with the Younger Dryas timeline. And then from there, of course, we have the Cataclysm, the Age of Heroes that Hesiod speaks of, and then finally into the Iron Age, into the Kali Yuga.
Yeah, I have kind of run into a similar idea. The details don't precisely align, but this idea that there has been a succession of like seats of spiritual development in humanity. The way it seems to me, you do have some kind of development in Southeast Asia, or perhaps, you know, there was a sunken continent in the ocean there as well, you know, this actual Lemurian land. You have a diversification of various Y DNA haplotypes there. And this is just a hunch that I have, but it seems to me that when you get one location that gives rise to several different Y-DNA markers, that's not just an indication of their material success, but there is some kind of spiritual virility. These particular spots where new kinds come into being, you know, similar to the Blavatskyan idea of the root races. I don't know if I align with all of her particulars either, but she has this idea of like the Lemurian root race, the Hyperborean root race, the Aryan root race. I think the Aryan is the fifth root race, and she postulates a sixth root race that will emerge out of California, in fact. So, yeah.
God help us all.
Right. Well, as a Californian myself, I take some solace in that. Of course, I mean, why have they destroyed California in the way they have? To blot out the sixth root race before, it's too late. So, Lemuria, I think there is something to that. But, do you happen to know, like, where the first boomerang is found?
I don't actually.
It's not Australia. In fact,
I assumed it wouldn't be if you're asking me.
Now, I actually don't remember whether it was the Carpathian Mountains or the Caucasus, but it is a mountain range in Southeast Europe. And there was a migration out of Europe right at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic that goes throughout Eurasia. And the early stocks in Southeast Asia seem to have been pretty different than the later racial stocks that we identify there. There's the Bradshaw art, this very ancient Australian Aboriginal art, cave art and rock art, that is more sophisticated. It's also sort of similar to some rock art that appears in the middle of the Sahara around like 7000 BC that Mary Sedegast talks about as perhaps one of the legacies of the Atlanteans who ended up in North Africa and eventually reached Egypt, leading to Egyptian civilization. But something like the Bradshaw art is an indication there was a very different stock in Southeast Asia. And the haplotype, Y-DNA haplotype K, diversifies in Southeast Asia. And one of its descendants, Y-DNA haplotype P, one of the few recorded instances of it in the record is Northeast Siberia. And then one of the descendants of P is haplotype R, which is the dominant European haplotype. R1b and R1a account for like 2/3 of European men, the others mainly being Y-DNA haplotype I. But I've noticed this connection between haplotype R1b and all of these kind of globalist, Atlanticist, and Atlantean legacies. I think what happened was there was a seat of cultural development in the Lemurian sphere. Some male line goes out of Lemuria and founds, Hyperborea in Siberia, associated archaeologically, maybe the late Hyperboreans, with the Malta-Buric culture, where you find the Malta boy, who is Y-DNA haplotype basal R, so before the R1a, R1b split. R1b perhaps originates in Hyperborea and then goes across to the west through Europe, and I think makes it to Atlantis. So this is how I think of the two Atlantises. There was the original Atlantis, founded by the original Arab nations. So right in the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic, I think they would have found this place quickly, because there were still Neanderthals around, and Neanderthals themselves had boats. So when you had like half and half Homo sapiens and Neanderthal people, it makes sense that they did kind of like adopt Neanderthal technology by and large in many places. They definitely could have used the boats of the Neanderthals and would have discovered Atlantis and then, developed there over thousands of years, but without like intense, sophisticated activity, simply like taking advantage of this nice, warm landmass, that has natural cold and hot springs and all the amenities that Plato kind of describes as being given by the gods, by Poseidon, right? And then later, you have the entry of this male lineage that was Lemurian and then Hyperborean, and now initiates like the new Atlantean phase of history where you get the rise of this power. What do you think of that idea, that there is like a particular male bloodline? Now I'm R1A, so I'm like a cousin to this line, if anything, but not to like aggrandize my own lineage. But what do you think of that idea that there could be like one male lineage kind of being the carrier vehicle of this kind of shifting location of spiritual centers of development?
It's certainly possible, but again, like, can we ever definitively prove it? Maybe not. I'm not 100% sure on your timeline necessarily. I don't know enough about like these different racial groups of antiquity to kind of like say definitively whether or not I think one makes a better case than the other. But just from kind of a more, I guess, mythological standpoint, it doesn't entirely make sense to me, this idea that someone from a cycle that is in its twilight at that time would have then gone all the way north and like started a new polar race there. Now, where the Hyperboreans came from, I don't know. But mythologically speaking, Hyperborea seems to be speaking to something not of this world, to a golden age that, you know, was not yet descended into matter. I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to like try to pin Hyperborea to a timeline as much as it might make sense to try to pin Atlantis to a timeline.
Right.
Atlantis was definitely like more solidified and participating in this world. I'm not convinced that Hyperborea would have been. I also have the question in my mind regarding, you know, the differences between the race of the body, race of the soul, race of the spirit, and the fact that, you know, as a cycle comes to its close and you see a sort of, you know, you see the caste system break down, you see this mixing of castes and people's outer appearances no longer match their inner nature. And so then it's kind of like, well, is the biological bloodline then actually the important thing? Are we maybe focusing too much on like a sort of almost biological racism when we should be focusing on whether or not this tradition is being passed down more through the spirit? That said, of course, there is a link between blood and spirit, and that is a question in my mind too. How strong is that link? How much does that link matter? You know, the blood does kind of atavistically carry within it these things from our sort of ancestral memory that could reappear at any time given the right stimulus. So those are just like, I'm not like coming to a conclusion on this. I'm just sort of putting it out there as like, these are maybe some of the reservations that I would have about that. I don't know if they're actually things that you can answer though, or that anybody could answer.
Right. It's sort of
so
a
I'm
Hebraic.
like doing the thing that they did on the documentaries I watched as a kid. I'm like, here's all this cool information. Yeah, we don't know anything.
I feel like there's something baked into even attempting to describe Atlantis that does this. In Plato's account, Solon intended to write like an epic poem about the Atlantis story, because Solon's the one who actually took this thing from Egypt and brought it back. And then he passes it on to Dropides, one of the ancestors of Critias. Critias eventually gets a hold of it, and Critias was a poet himself. We've lost all of his poems and plays, but in any case, the question is like, why didn't Critias or any of his relatives share this story? Well, there were multiple like very competent and famous poets who, according to Plato's narrative, had access to this story. The natural inclination would be to do it its proper justice and present it to the world in a remarkable way. And then Plato finally is the one who actually makes it public, but with the Timaeus, right? The Critias was never published in his lifetime. So he goes into just the most cursory details about Atlantis, and that's allowed by fate somehow. Like Plato is allowed to be the one who introduces this thing. And then he's not able to finish the Critias. You know, it breaks off like mid-line, basically. Zeus is saying, like, you know, because of the way they've been acting, we should do this to Atlantis. And then the story's over. And some people in antiquity said that's because Plato died at that moment. Some people say he moved on to work on his laws. He just abandoned it. But it doesn't look like a totally like unfinished or unproductive work. It looks like part of a planned trilogy of the Timaeus, the Critias, and then the non-existent Hermocrates. So yeah, it's weird like that. It's like when you try to talk about Atlantis or try to look into evidence of Atlantis, there's a very definite thing that you're encountering. You know, there's some reality to it that makes itself known but won't disclose itself fully and puts up these barriers in weird ways. So anyway, I do think there's something to that. But the idea of this founding lineage, you know, is a kind of Hebraic idea, like the Adamic man. You know, people have speculated whether Adam wasn't, you know, the true first man, but like the first man of a new spiritual type. Because, you know, first of all, where did Cain's wife come from, right? Like it says they describe these particular children that Adam and Eve had, and then they find women. From where, you know? So that doesn't exactly line up. But then you trace this Adamic line all the way down through Abraham and the various descendants and the various nations that are offshoots of that. And so maybe that is like one perspective on some truth. You know, I've often
That's very
found it
similar, though, to how other populations, ancient populations, would have like their list of descent that all trace back to like a god or semi-divine being.
right.
And that makes me also wonder about, you know, the potential origins. If we do have a divine origin, then to suggest that, oh, the Hyperboreans just came from like some Lemurian who made his way up there and populated that. It's like, but now that's a very biological origin. And every myth seems to speak to the fact that we do have divine origins as humans.
Right.
There's no traditional text that gives any credence to this idea that we evolved from animals or that we had any kind of like bestial human origins.
Right. Well,
So that's another thing that's kind of like,
I had a video recently about like, is time real? That concept. And again, for me, the past is like a cloud of possibility. In a sense, projecting back into the historical past is like looking at a realm of shadows. The true realities are the archetypal cultures and races that are out there for all time. Like, in a way, Atlantis is eternal. There is this archetype of the thalassocratic, expansionist, kind of advanced group that's, preeminent in this, like, distant past. Jason Reza Georgiani says that he was, in a past life, a resident of Atlantis, but he has a similar idea as well, that there is, like, this one particular archetypal race that instantiates at various different points in history. So it has this persisting reality, and he describes it from his kind of characteristic time-based and flux-based Heraclitean approach as a race that has mastered time travel. So they've kind of become eternal and can skip around this timeline, and they always manifest the same kind of megalithic, symmetrical, perfectly geometric forms, because that's like the outward manifestation of their nature, which is attained to this kind of eternal status. They've become exempt from time. Now, it's interesting, he doesn't, like the Atlanteans, even though he says he was one of them. Like, his project is to dismantle this eternal man and embrace, like, the freedom that comes with the creativity of other spiritual types. Let's just put it that way. But this is, again, the issue of that relation between mythical time and historical time. And Proclus, talking about how to interpret Plato's myths and also just other Greek myths, says that myths temporalize a system which is really eternal. So when we talk about, the Lemurian going to Hyperborea and then the Hyperborean going to Atlantis, this may be a corporeal reflection, and you would expect to have this evidence in some form, and there is genetic evidence of that, population movement. Somebody from Southeast Asia moved to Siberia, and then that same line eventually moved to Europe. But you would expect to have that shadow in the material world's history of this kind of eternal succession of spiritual forms. So, maybe we can kind of shift into this idea of the spiritual race of the Atlanteans. Like, what if there is this archetypal Atlantean out there? What is his characteristics? What can we say about the archetypal Atlantean?
Well, we're basically looking at something an archetype that is post-fall of man. So the first thing I would say to that is, do we actually want to use Atlantean man as an archetype to aspire to? I'm not entirely sure that we do. However, the key component of Atlantis that is important in that regard is this so-called race of heroes that arises out of the cataclysm, the ones that Zeus saves from the flood. And these are the ones, so this would be in our second Atlantis, right? Our kind of like deteriorated spiritual Bronze Age. So what are these inhabitants of Atlantis like? Well, their qualities are described as, violence and injustice and power hungry. They're very covetous and arrogant and prideful. They break their oaths. They're criminals. So this is the sort of titanic warrior revolt that no longer, as I said, no longer recognizes the lunar priestly authority. And then it tries to reaffirm itself, but it does so in this really inferior way that lacks a connection to the divine. They just end up becoming brutes. So it's this really degenerated attempt to restore virility, and this Promethean impulse where they sort of tried to steal the fire of the gods. Again, this fire comes back into view. They tried to steal this fire, this special power. They didn't know how to carry it. They weren't worthy to carry it. And so they were punished for it. There are sort of two categories of myths that come out of this. And one is the one where man tries to take something that's divine and he's not worthy of it, and so he has the fall, which is the biblical Genesis, for example. But the other version is when he is actually successful, and then he becomes a hero, he attains this Olympian immortality, and he actually is successful at reaffirming this spiritual virility and the hyperborean quality of his soul. So with this age of heroes, they're the Titans who succeeded, essentially. They're the ones who didn't fail at this. And what that essentially means is, well, they overcame the feminine. They overcame both this lunar gynocracy as well as the degenerated Amazonian tendencies and the aphrodisic tendencies of the seductress. They overcame all of that and restored a solar principle within themselves. So we still find like this theme of the dyad, but now it's in this Grail cycle context. The Grail cycle is really, it's a Hyperborean legend, but it's really speaking to this quest of the man of the Age of Heroes, of the Atlantean man that is maybe worth emulating and can tell us something about our path to spiritual transcendence. So, in this case, woman represents this sort of vivifying principle or power. It's the object of this conquest. And because he is a hero, it doesn't destroy his virile character. It just allows him to integrate it, now bringing the dyad back into unity. And so we get kind of this relation to the solar symbolism of Atlantis, where it's become associated with a principle of change and transformation rather than being the Hyperborean principle of just like the immutable, eternal being. But he's taken this, he's transformed it, and he's transfigured it into his own internal light. So this is the spiritual race of Atlantis that is actually interesting to me, because all of the others are at various stages of degeneracy from the Hyperborean Golden Age ideal, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Does that answer your question appropriately?
There are a few dimensions to it, so it might be oversimplistic to just talk about the one archetypal Atlantean. Atlantis is multifaceted, and the spiritual races that kind of hover around it are manifold. So that's interesting. There would be that kind of higher and lower aspect. Now, with Hyperborea, now this is something that you don't associate as much with the literal historical time. But what do you think of that kind of Hyperborean root race or spiritual race, and what are their qualities? And what about, you went into it some, but like how do they survive and how do they fail? Is there an analogous kind of higher and lower aspect like with the Atlanteans?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions in my mind around the fall and what actually sort of caused it, because if you have the Golden Age and it's in a state of being, what actually happened to cause this to change? Isn't it immutable? Isn't it eternal? Why is there now this decline? And I wonder if it actually just has to be like that, like that's just the law of the cosmos. Because in order for like if you go into like the Vedas and that tradition, you have this idea of Purusha, the masculine principle, or Shiva, sometimes you might hear it called, versus the feminine principle, Prakriti or Shakti. And Purusha is, he's unmanifest. He's not fully, he has not fully reached his potential in his own state. And it's said that all he did was just glance at Prakriti, and she began to be overcome with desire, and she began to move. And in this meeting of the two, of undifferentiated spirit, that's just pure spirit, but has no way to actually manifest itself and reach its full flowering, meeting matter, which is on its own, nothing. It needs a higher ordering principle in order to construct it into something. Now we get the full flowering of all of God's potentialities because of this meeting with matter. However, matter has its own set of principles, its own rules. And so you can think of it as kind of like the myth of Narcissus, who gazed into a pond and fell in love with his own reflection, fell in and drowned. This is almost essentially like what we have with the Purusha principle. It's like it gazed into its own reflection, fell in love with what it saw, its own potential, and dove into the descent into the feminine. And from this, we get a lot of the principles of, for example, like the royal art, the Hermetic arts, and the white work versus the red work, and so on and so forth. And that this seems to be related to this cycle of ages, that as we get deeper and deeper into the Kali Yuga, we are reaching the final stage of the white work, where the masculine is almost completely subsumed into the feminine, before having this violent reaction against what is, all too human within itself. This is what we're supposed to do on our path, right? This violent reaction, and then suddenly this reassertion of the principle of being that then sparks the next golden age. And so because of this cyclical nature of history, it's almost like, well, maybe we just can't really get out of this time loop. At the point in which the masculine principle contacted the feminine, like that's it now for eternity. There's no real going back to unity, because in order to do that, everything material would have to be annihilated, and that probably will happen at some point. I mean, it's said that when Shiva exhales and inhales, the birth and death of universes occur. So potentially, one day this material cosmos will be annihilated, but as it stands currently, it seems like there are these necessary cycles. And so the fall of Hyperborea is one of these cycles. It's probably not the first cycle. It's probably not the original golden age. But it is a golden age. It was a return to something. And now we're on that path again. We're approaching the bottom of this white work, and then the red work begins and a new golden age starts.
Yeah, that's great. Again, mythic time versus historical time, this cycling is baked into the nature of our soul as well. So we hold these tensions in ourselves that manifest backwards and forwards into history, I would say. And like, are we consigned to this fate? In my perspective, like, we will to be what we are, and that comes with all of the kind of karmic baggage and the fatalistic consequences that entails. So to say that it is a necessary cycle, I think should be qualified. It's a necessary cycle for fallen souls. So I wouldn't say like you won't necessarily encounter the obliteration of this cosmos and the birth of a new one, provided you like take Plato's advice and ascend into the realm of forms.
That is what the Olympian path is. That is what these heroes were meant to do, is to kind of come back to that realm. And as you say, the difference between mythological time and historical time, it's like, well, there's so many myths that really point to the fact that if you want to return to the golden age, you need to recreate it in yourself, essentially. And then you just kind of, you live there. You're not so much a man against time as a man outside of time at that point. Right.
So this idea of I guess, primordial man is also characterized as a giant in various traditions. Like Ymir is the equivalent figure in Norse mythology to Purusha, and actually it seems to be a deeper mythic element than the Indo-European root, even, like, because in Egypt, Ptah is this similar kind of like giant man that the universe is carved out of, in a sense. And that giant is also associated with a bull. So Ymir, I think, if I'm getting the order of events right, like is transformed into a giant bull and then is dismembered to make the cosmos. But that's an interesting thing that I got from Mary Sedagast, that the Mithraic mysteries involving this slaying of the bull actually predate the Zoroastrian reforms. So people think of like Iranian religion as this one Zoroastrian thing, but actually the Mithraic mythological component and the slaying of the bull, which represents that very principle that you're talking about, like the encounter of the masculine with the feminine and the generation of the world through this kind of dismembering of that eternal archetypal being. That goes back to very ancient times, and these ancient Zagros cultures in the early Neolithic, Setagast talks about how that kind of spread westward, and the actual archaeology lines up with that, spread rather eastward from the kind of core of the new development that succeeded that fall of Atlantis, which was in the Near East. So that's an interesting thing, the kind of new spiritual race that was born in the Holocene in the Near East with Göbekli Tepe. How were they related to the Atlanteans before them? And then, how true is that? Like, was it a recognition of this kind of Mithraic mystery? But one other point about that is Plato describes the kind of most sacred ritual of the Atlantean kings as the slaying of a bull using like archaic tools. Now, on the one hand, that's very plausible if this Atlantic island existed and you had European Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers inhabit it. They would probably try to bring animals there because that was their preferred food. Maybe they didn't even discover agriculture. Plato says they did, but maybe not. And I mean, they had aurochs. You take an infant auroch and bring it on a boat to this new place. Bring quite a few of them. You can have managed herds. It's a natural, enclosure, the island. So it would be easy hunting. In a lot of ways, the Atlanteans would have just had it easy. This more in the vein of that kind of Cronian age. Nature just kind of looks after us benevolently. So the bull goes all the way back to that time, and maybe it's that like, I don't know, that this act of the slaying of the bull that at some level also symbolizes that turning from the original Atlantis to the later Atlantis, and with that, like the imposition of this tyranny and force and colonial expansion. But yeah, so I definitely see a lot of mythological resonances to what you're saying, and it's not random that you bring that up with Perugia. But what about this? I'd like to, if we can, just move on to this kind of Near Eastern question. So what do you think about that race of the founders of the Neolithic, and how do they relate to the Atlanteans? Because I think just like from Hyperborea to Atlantis, there is a connection from Atlantis to the Göbekli Tepes.
What traditionalism kind of lays out is this idea that, okay, we had the Hyperborean polar seat, something happened, perhaps the pole shift. This seems to maybe line up with that. But for whatever reason, it started to freeze over. It was no longer inhabitable. Winter came. And so we have these migrations out. And so we have a first migration down into like India, the Fertile Crescent, Persia, that sort of region. That's where you find these spiritualities that are the most direct descendants of the Hyperborean one, although obviously corrupted now in the modern age by various different elements. And then you had a second migration in which, the seat of Atlantis is being established, and you have a lot of this east-west migratory waves, which, this first group, we have this sort of more immediate Arctic derivation, and this becomes the strains of all the Aryan races, this northern component. And then there's this second group that becomes, in these east-west migrations, becomes sort of mixed with these aboriginal southern races, these residues of Lemuria. And so this includes the so-called like red races that were the last inhabitants of Atlantis in the spiritual Bronze Age. And these are like the original ethnic stock of several of the more newer civilizations, relatively newer, I guess, of these east-west migratory waves. So like the Pelasgians, the Egyptians, all the American civilizations that has all this Atlantic component to it.
Yeah. So if anyone, by the way, wants to like look at the genetic evidence that I looked at, there is a video on my channel, Genetic Evidence for Atlantis, and there is stuff from North America that is very interesting in that respect. But okay, what about then the Atlantean stock that reaches the Near East? I mean, there's various kind of more ancient and advanced types that converge, and this becomes this locus of the new development. what kind of role do you think that Atlantean residue had in the Near East? I'll just say to
So
start,
where
yeah,
specifically are you referring to?
Göbekli Tepe is the seat of
Okay.
it. That's like where it all gets kicked off
Yeah, I would put that with this second group of this east-west migratory wave.
from Atlantis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because this east-west expansion is essentially kind of like, it seems to be like the height of the Atlantean colonial power, and now like by this point Hyperborea is like no longer inhabitable at all. The third wave of the Hyperboreans settled in northern Europe. They have their own, they were very spiritually degenerated by the time they left, although more, biologically pure in that sense. But this second group had already, left. They'd already had contact with these southern races, these darker races, which, that would have been in the band of where we find Göbekli Tepe and a lot of also these other civilizations.
Now, the way I look at Göbekli Tepe, its timing right after the Younger Dryas and the various stocks that seem to have been involved. I mean, there certainly was a lot of the same kind of genetic cluster. Anatolian hunter-gatherers, you had Caucasus hunter-gatherers involved somewhat too, and then like a distinct population with the Natufians who gradually through time kind of blended with the Anatolian hunter-gatherers to some extent. But there were like distinct ethnic types, and then the Zagros, Iranian Neolithic had its own kind of genetic signatures, similar to the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, but probably distinct ethnic types. They all are united in some sense culturally. I think with Göbekli Tepe, there's evidence of like specialization in the manufacture of obsidian artifacts, and they would be sourced from these sites inhabited by Caucasus hunter-gatherers and then often shipped to post-Natufian groups further to the south. So there does seem to be like a hierarchical element there, and the Caucasus hunter-gatherers weren't on the upper hand of the deal there. So who was orchestrating this? Who was kind of leading this new Neolithic development? My hypothesis for a long time has been that this is a site that was chosen by the elites that survived the collapse of Atlantis. There's another possibility, though, that things actually began much more amiably with Göbekli Tepe, and that the population in general across the world had shrunk so much in the Younger Dryas that there was this kind of common humanity that was recognized, and they built this monument to like warn future humanity about these cataclysms that can come. There's a book, I didn't read it, but I actually can't find it. I looked at it once and then I don't remember the author's name, but a book that like analyzes all of the artwork in Göbekli Tepe along astronomical lines and says like there are precursors to the zodiacal constellations indicated and stuff like that. And the story that he gives is this kind of, there's a warning and a monument to the possibility of these, balls of fire from the sky, these comet impacts. And so Neolithic civilization was kind of a band of refugees of various different stocks. But of course, like whether it began amiably or began as a kind of colonial project, eventually a particular stock would have probably come to dominate. So do you think, like my hypothesis has always been that it is the Atlanteans. The Atlanteans have been behind the Neolithic. They're the ones who were the pharaohs in Egypt. They're the ones who I think still hold power today. So what about that notion, what power is there from the Atlantean times in more like modern human civilizations?
Well, I would say that there's probably a descent from Atlantis simply because that's historically the most recent thing. It's what we would more realistically have remnants from. Evola says it like this. I don't know what you think about this because you know more about the genetics and stuff. And obviously, when he was writing his books, they didn't have all this like haplogroups research going on, but he says that Cro-Magnon man corresponds to the Atlantean races, and that these are, the white gods that we hear about, these white civilizing gods that show up all over the place. But in regards to I don't know if it's this I have heard this idea before that, like, oh, they were trying to warn humanity about future cataclysms. I don't know if that, I don't know if I find that plausible, just because I'm thinking, like, if I just survived a cataclysm, the last thing on my mind would be warning somebody 20,000 years down the road what might happen to them. Like, I might be traumatized from it and documenting it in my art, but I'm not building a massive structure to warn people in the hopes that it will survive the sands of time. But obviously, like, it's a significant myth, and it has spiritual significance. We know that these people were much more spiritual people than we are today. What kind of tale they might have been trying to tell, what sort of lesson this is meant to teach, what they're actually trying to record. I don't know that this is something we can really definitively say one way or the other. To some extent, these people are always going to be a mystery to us. And, you know, Gwenon mentions like 3 time barriers that we come up against in even trying to answer questions about ancient prehistory. You know, we've got, first of all, we've got right around the 6th century BC, the sort of beginning of recorded history. And before this time, chronologies start to get really hazy. We can have some chronologies, and so then we get to the next time barrier, which is the beginning of the Kali Yuga, or what he considers to be the Kali Yuga. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about when that actually starts, but he says, you know, that the beginning of the Kali Yuga is the absolute limit of things that can be known by archaeological evidence or anthropology. That we do have some evidence from, you know, before recorded history, but it's just really difficult to date. Things like Göbekli Tepe, for example, would fall into that category. And we cannot cross that boundary, he says. But if we could, we would find a third boundary, and that would just be the terrestrial cataclysm of Atlantis that's just wiped out so much, and we can't even imagine what we might have lost from that. So, you know, it's just so difficult to assess these questions and come to any real definitive conclusion. And I find it so frustrating. And this is part of why I've just sort of turned my attention to the mythological value of it. It's like, well, if I can't know, then I'm going to stick with what I can know, because it makes me angry that I don't have these answers.
Yeah. Well, the way I look at
I don't feel fulfilled watching Ancient Apocalypse. I just want to know what the answer is, and you're not going to give me the answer. And now I'm mad that I watched 8 episodes of it.
Well, I'm pretty sure the answer isn't in the past, strictly speaking. It is this more kind of archetypal existence. The particular archaeological evidence we have is, to give an analogy, like classical information specifying concrete distinctions that is surrounded by a kind of superposition of all the possible entailments of that concrete structure. So there's one concrete limit that's given, and then surrounding that is this cloud of indefinite possibility. However, the particular specifications we get in archaeology are from the past of our time, and they are therefore like mundane specifications. So we have a 3-tiered structure that I'm kind of suggesting for like what is behind at the archetypal level. There's the particular data that like tracks, or rather like gravitates us towards particular archetypal realities. It is surrounded by a cloud of probability. But then beyond that, there is the eternal limiting principles, the formal realities that determine the law of that probability. So the particular evidence we encounter that we have access to defines us in some sense, and itself defines a realm of probable kind of archetypal structuring principles. And then that is itself structured at a deeper level by these like universal laws beyond the world of generation. Things like Y-DNA haplotype markers, I think, are important because they carry a lot of information and specify that kind of probability spectrum to a very high degree. So you can know with, you know, the Y-DNA that you have through specific mutations exactly where your father's line traveled. Obviously not your father's line because you don't have a Y-DNA marker, but same thing with mtDNA. These things give a huge amount of information about where people in the deep past lived. genetics gives us access to this information in a relatively concrete form. Of course, our genetic analysis doesn't give us like exact dates, just like our archaeological evidence doesn't give us exact dates, but these are like structuring things that tell us about the past. Now, the way that that concrete historical timeline interfaces with those kind of archetypal races is that, you know, to take the Y-DNA again, we know that 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, our paternal ancestor was in this region. Now we know what the climate was like in that region. We know what the archaeological toolkit was that the cultures in that region had, you know, like the Malta-Buric culture. I wouldn't say that the Malta-Buric culture is Hyperborea, but knowing the life that these people would have lived, that puts them adjacent to kind of these parallel worlds that are relatively fixed in nature. It's I don't know if you ever watched like Joss Whedon's Buffy or Angel series. No, okay. So in that, he has this idea that there were like a finite number of parallel worlds that we have access to. And I think that is true as well. Like at one level, I subscribe to a multiverse where there's like infinitely many branching timelines. But it's like with, you know, you have several sources of waves being emitted, these very definite structures get produced. It's not pure randomness in these interference patterns. So although there is a wide branching and infinite probability, somehow that coalesces and gets defined in these very particular structures that surround us at a deep level. So like we have access to particular parallel worlds with their own kind of histories, and that comes through to us in myth. But that changes through time because the worlds we have access to are shaped by the technologies that we have today, the language we have today. So the idea is like now we're parallel to, I don't know, the Pelagian, you know, race, whatever that is. People talk about this like race of aliens, the Nordics or whatever, that come from this particular star in, I think it's Orion's belt actually. So we have a definite location for it in our time.
Do you mean the Pleiadians?
Yeah, that's what I mean. That there you go.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, not Pelagian. I think that's the.
But yeah.
Right. So yeah.
I think you said Pelasgians.
I think I did because I was thinking about the Greeks before. So yeah, the Pleiadians, that's one example of this kind of parallel world to ours that we have access to. Now, what would the Hyperboreans, or rather the Malta-Buric culture people, have been parallel to with this like vastly different style of life and style of thought? So that's another kind of dimension, how the mythic time and these mythic archetypal societies interface with the kind of historical time, but they are connected. You know, like the history matters, but it's not as significant as the kind of mythic structures that history brings with it into being.
Yeah, well, we kind of have, you know, we have the eternal existing up here in like kind of a straight line, and then the waves of history kind of sometimes come up and more or less meet that and intersect with it.
Right. Yeah.
Like
and
the eternality is always just there and fixed. And it's like, well, how much do the cycles of history more or less approximate the eternal?
Right. And there will be a periodicity with which we approach that eternal. And so we get then these root races entering into history at particular times and places and things along those lines. So we talked about most of the things we wanted to discuss. If you don't mind, I do kind of just want to give the story that I've got on the archaeological and genetic side that I kind of am going with for the moment. And then I'd like to get your feedback with how that like fits in with your mythological reading. So the way I see it, we have, and you can kind of go back arbitrarily far, but let's just start with the kind of precursors to the Aurignacian culture in the Levant around 50,000 years ago. So in Europe, prior to that time, it's entirely Neanderthal populations, and you know that's an interesting question. What sort of spiritual races and mythological archetypal civilizations were the Neanderthals connected to? So that's a whole different regime of myth that was operating up there with its own differentiations. Like the Neanderthals, some Neanderthals in Portugal actually appear to have been vegetarian. They cooked vegetables and didn't eat meat. which is not a typical picture we get. So yeah, Neanderthals were not all created equal. But in any case, these Levantine Homo sapiens, already Neanderthal admixed, end up in Southeast Europe. I think they do interbreed with Neanderthals around the vicinity of the Carpathian Sphinx, because I think that's a spot of spiritual development where you have this like natural setting for a sacred, priest caste to emerge. This is a really remarkable mountain valley, highly defensible. It has this, the Sphinx, which is notable. It has these other, acoustical properties that make it suitable for ritual. And so that's this center of gravity, and you get various forces, Neanderthal and Homo sapien forces, kind of coming together and creating this new man. That new man, the Aurignacian man, Cro-Magnon man, spreads westward, leads to the earlier Aurignacian, and then interestingly, 37,300 BC, you have the Campanian ignimbrite eruption in southern Italy. And this isn't as devastating as the Younger Dryas boundary, but this is a supervolcano, and very likely, like, all humans living, at least in Europe at that time, would have gone deaf from the sound of the eruption alone, totally disrupting their way of life. It would have got substantially colder, and this is already during an ice age, for 3 to 5 years. And we know from the genetic evidence that the very earliest Aurignacian people were not particularly related to modern-day Europeans, but then those that followed were more related. So this is like the hard reset. This is the new race that emerges there with the late Aurignacians, and they are the ones that move and settle Atlantis. They develop in parallel. Now, meanwhile, on the European continent, the Gravettian culture moves in. They also have early sites with significant kind of artistic work in the Carpathian Mountains, again testifying to there's like a spiritual center of development there, but their stock goes all the way to Russia, most likely. So we have this Russian stock move down and replace the old Aurignacian stock in Europe. The Gravettians were tall. They were 6 feet tall on average, high cheekbones, seemingly a very noble kind of people, but they didn't have the visual artistic sophistication of the early Aurignacians, or even late Aurignacians. Now, interestingly, Mary Sedagast says that the Athenian population, the ancient Athens or Proto-Athens, was a Gravettian population. So Gravettians emphasized like the sort of thing actually that Socrates describes at the very beginning of the Republic as like the ideal way of life, a very simple economic system. The Gravettians situated their settlements, and they did have like permanent residence settlements like Dolny Vestinich back 30,000 years ago. They situated these settlements at where they knew the migration routes of the game that they were tracking would go through. So they were master hunters. They developed nets. They had needles for sewing cloth. They had very fine textiles. So this is a particular area of development of culture that the Gravettians specialized in, leading to a kind of simplistic village lifestyle subsisting primarily on wild game. Now, this is not the same as the Aurignacians, who developed really sophisticated visual art and were probably the ones who developed these first musical instruments. So the Aurignacians are all about these technologies that would allow them to mind control each other. What does visual art do? Why do people make visual art? To create an impression on other people and influence other people. Joseph Campbell talks about the kind of men's rites of initiation that go all across North Africa, all the way into Melanesia. And in Australia, Aboriginal tribes, the men used to use an instrument that they never allowed the women to see. They would go like outside of the village at night and use this instrument and say that this was the sound of a monster. And then the men would go out and say they defeated the monster, and this would keep the women like afraid of this monster, women and children afraid of the monster, and thankful to the men, allowing the men to like maintain their patriarchal dominance. That's the idea. But anyway, Joseph Campbell traces this back. Also, there were men's rites of initiation in Aurignacian Europe So they made a lot of these artworks in caves, and this would also be a suitable place for like a coming of age ritual, suitable place also for musical performance. So they probably also use psychedelic drugs. I mean, this was the sort of specialization these people engaged in. So in Atlantis, in an island context, they are really good visual artists, really good musicians, really good at manipulating each other. So you would get super intense hierarchical structures developing, especially this is just something that naturally happens on islands. Like you mentioned Malta earlier. Malta was one of the earliest resurgences of the megalithic age, after even like the Balearic Islands, which is an interesting thing itself. Like the megalithic age re-enters the picture from west to east, not from east to west as you would expect given the development in the Near East. But in any case, the Atlanteans emphasize kind of taking advantage of the natural conditions. They have natural hot and cold running water on Atlantis. They have a naturally temperate environment. They're just gifted by the gods, and they specialize in these technologies of human control. The Gravettians, on the other hand, build their own structures. They're very kind of open society. They seem to have revered women more so, judging from some of the visual art that survives. We don't have to get into the specifics of that, but in any case, two very different lifestyles. The ancient Athenians, or proto-Athenians, Plato says, had the structure of the guardians, so they had male and female guardians, another indication they were more of kind of an equal society. Maybe the kind of undifferentiated Hyperborean type was still visible in them to some degree. And the Atlanteans, in the meanwhile, like after the entrance of this R1b lineage, begin actually getting technologically sophisticated. So the R1b lineage goes all the way through Gravettian Europe, learns all their technologies, and then that leads to a synthesis. You have the Gravettian technological mastery together with the Aurignacian artistic mastery, and then you have the growth of this potential imperial power on the Atlantean island. They start colonizing nearby places, western Spain. Plato basically names specifically as Cadiz, that is modern-day Cadiz, which is a port in that region, and a few other colonies. They keep on developing. I think they had one primary, this is something I realized recently with the genetic evidence, they had one primary slave class in the form of the Metaphysical people, who lived in Morocco and just northwestern Africa generally. They're the Ibero-Maurutian culture. And when they were first discovered, I mean, they're called the Ibero-Maurutians because the people who discovered them thought there were, striking similarities between Spanish industries and this Northwest African industry. So they thought this was one continuous development. There's also genetic evidence suggesting close ties in some Ibero-Mauritian populations and modern-day Spanish populations. So the Ibero-Mauritians were not entirely native to Northwest Africa, although some of them certainly were, and they had Y-DNA haplotype E1b in all likelihood, as most Africans in that region do. So there's a kind of historical irony here in that you would have had a thalassocratic, island-based, R1b-led culture enslaving E1b darker-skinned Africans, which is probably that exact same thing happened in Egypt. You had an R1b ruling class enslaving E1b darker Africans. Same thing in American slavery. So it's weird how these like bloodlines have karmic relationships to each other seemingly that just persist for huge spans of time. So that's kind of the model that I've been working with, and I think Plato's War is a condensed account of something that took thousands of years. And then, basically I think these cataclysms, first of all, the defeat of Athens, I don't know how true that may be, but in either case, the Younger Dryas collapse, impact happens, a lot of natural wildlife is game is destroyed. They have to migrate. A lot of people migrate to the Near East. and then eventually this Atlantean ruling elite regains control. So that's kind of how I see it at the moment. What do you think of that picture as far as that lines up with the mythological evidence you've looked at?
So when you say the Atlanteans kind of like took over the ruling elite everywhere, are you basing that on these haplogroups that you're tracing?
No, I mean, it's also the idea of secret, esoteric knowledge that is held within priest castes and is not allowed out. So just the fact that there was such intense social stratification and advanced techniques for social manipulation, like some of the earliest large villages in the Near East feature sacrificial stones that we've found human blood from. So there was human sacrifice going on, which has gone on in many cultures, but like there was a caste set apart, seemingly, and there is a discrepancy where some sites, like Asikli-Hoyuk in Anatolia, look like work camps. And you can tell from the age of those who were buried and the sex ratios that the elites didn't live there. And then you have other sites like, not Cheanu. Cheanu is also advanced. But this site nearby Göbekli Tepe, I always forget it. Forget the name of it. Navali Chori. Navali Chori was flooded in the early 1990s, shortly after it was discovered by the construction of a dam. That's something I've talked about before. Like, these people build dams and flood so many of these crucial early Neolithic sites. But Navali Chori has like these advanced statues. It even looked like it had perhaps column architecture. But it just shows like regional differentiation where you had super advanced groups in one place controlling populations in another place. So that, I can't infer on Y-DNA alone that there was this advanced elite group, but it seems like somebody was way more sophisticated than the rest of the people in the Near East to start with. And then you think about like the myth of the Anunnaki from Sumer, the idea that there was this kind of race of watchers, divinely descended people with superhuman knowledge from also, they say, the Northwest, a mountain in the Northwest. Göbekli Tepe is built on a hill northwest of the Sumerian settlements. So, and
if I understand correctly from watching your other videos, your premise is also that this kind of like these remnants of the Atlantean elite are the current global elite. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my view on that is I don't know enough about like all the haplogroup stuff to speak to that, but it sounds like, I mean, it's really interesting. I would like to learn more about it. But from a more esoteric point of view, one thing that I have come across on more than one occasion is, okay, so first of all, this idea that the Atlanteans were using black magic in an inappropriate way, and this somehow contributed to their decline and fall. But then we see these Atlantean spiritual practices popping up in places like, Egypt, the Americas, like the Aztecs, for example, but often in like really twisted, corrupted ways. Like the human sacrifice of the Aztecs is really not in line with, a Hyperborean spirituality, something, it seems like it degenerated into like a sort of superstition that a ruling class benefited from. We also have in Egypt, for example, this theory that within the initiatic priestly caste where this magic was taught and held, that an initiate would kind of go through the process, but something's being held back from him such that even though he goes through the process, he's not actually attaining the spiritual virility necessary, and it's being held secretly by these, descendants of these Atlantean priests who are maybe using it inappropriately or trying to keep it out of the hands of people who would use it for good. And, we have then, of course, the decline and downfall of the Egyptian civilization as well. So there does seem to be some merit to the idea that this Atlantean ruling class, as they migrated everywhere, we have, of course, the myths of all of these, the civilizing gods that come and basically teach the local populations things about law and agriculture and all of this other stuff, teach them art. But the locals, of course, know that this isn't, it's not their native tradition. It's been brought to them from these civilizer gods and kings. So, yeah, you do obviously see within both historical testaments from the people who were actually affected, as well as mythologically, you have this idea that, there's this Atlantean, these refugees, I guess you could say, or maybe they even went out and when they came back, they found Atlantis was gone. I don't know what happened, but for whatever reason, they left and they brought these cultures everywhere. And sometimes they stayed and sometimes they didn't. But in terms of whether or not that elite still exists today, that part I have more questions about, but I wouldn't rule it out completely just because of the number of things you hear about what really sound like very sort of black magic type of rituals, satanic sort of stuff that they engage in. That's just, it's really weird. And it's okay, well, what that essentially taking real magical principles and inverting them to do bad things with them. I don't believe that the global elite actually have the spiritual virility, however, to master these forces on their own. So that then, of course, raises some other questions of okay, which demon did you guys do a deal with?
Right.
You aren't good enough to do this yourself. Something, and the nature of what they're doing does suggest some kind of demonic entanglement on a spiritual level. So you may be onto something with this. I can't say for certain, but it's a really interesting theory.
Yeah. I think any deal with a spirit like that would have been relatively late in the game, and I think it probably would have been associated with a mercantile Near Eastern population. The Gnostics, for example, many Gnostics believed that Yahweh was a demon, and Christ was showing kind of the way to get out of this deal that would ultimately lead to the ruin of humanity. So, I get, who knows about something like that, but yeah.
Well, I think there might be some merit to that because, you do see, for example, you see in the Bible this idea of Abraham being told to sacrifice his son.
Yeah.
And this isn't really something that God in the more New Testament conception speaks to at all. But where else do you see human sacrifice? Well, for example, we just mentioned the Aztecs, right? This idea of spilling human blood or other bodily fluids is, from a magical perspective, frequently thought to attract demonic entities who feed off the energies of, these fluids and the emotions that are poured into them, fear and pain and suffering. And so the more that you do that in the same spot, in the same way, the more that you attract these influences.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. I went
when
visit...
you consider some of the stuff that the global elite have been accused of doing, it really falls in line with that.
Precisely, yes. I went to visit Tenochtitlan, which is one of these.
Oh, cool!
I think actually Mayan sites. I don't know if it was Aztec or Mayan. The Mayan's the more ancient one, right? So I think it was, and it had a certainly a real vibe to it that just you could not ignore, and that was just being there changed the way that I was thinking at a very fundamental level. Where prior to that time, I was more of a libertarian, and then being in that place, seeing the potency of this collected human effort from primitive people, seeing just it has it's not even just perfect architectural symmetry and design, but an organic, the entire site had an organic unity where you just knew whoever lived there and was practicing there, they were a hive mind. This was another form of human consciousness. So maybe that's the undegenerated version. And then by the time the Spanish get there and interact with these people, they're, slaughtering dozens of people.
Yeah, by the time the Spanish
It's
came,
just-
this was no longer a true solar religion in any meaningful sense of the word. It was, it sounded very corrupted.
Right. Yeah.
But the elements are there that point to it at one time being a true solar religion, something that we could have, this is the great shame of what the Spanish did. Is you can say, oh, well, of course they should slaughter people who are slaughtering other people because two wrongs make a right, apparently. But it's like, did you have to destroy all of the knowledge from that as well? Did you have to be like so completely destructive? And it's such a great loss, because I wish we could have known more about what they thought before the Spanish got there, before it had degenerated. I want to know, like, what was their original religion?
Right. Well, Christians burned the Library of Alexandria, right? And they...
Well,
they weren't
that
just
got burned on a few occasions.
A few occasions, yeah. One of the more major times where a lot of knowledge
another
was lost.
Tragic loss to humanity that I sometimes lose sleep over.
I'm a Christian, but I think there's a big difference between mythological, primordial Christianity and how these Orthodox groups were organized and what they were doing. I just started on Pseudo-Dionysus.
They were pursuing temporal power. Essentially,
I think it's deeper than that. Yeah, I was just starting on Pseudo-Dionysus, so he went by the name Dionysus the Areopagite in his writings because this is someone who's attested in the Book of Acts. So supposedly this is a 1st century author. He was taken to be this 1st century Christian author. Eminent theologian Thomas Aquinas cites him extensively. Maximus the Confessor, who's basically like the preeminent theologian in Eastern Orthodoxy, it writes commentaries on his works. So this becomes absolutely essential for all of mainstream Orthodox and Catholic Christianity, Pseudo-Dionysus. And I've known for, quite a while that he was influenced by Proclus and was actually a late 5th century author, early 6th century author. But now starting on the divine names, this is explicitly like the technical vocabulary that Proclus used. And of course Proclus practiced theurgy. The late Neoplatonists were the most accomplished occultists in history that we know of, with maybe the exception of some very deeply esoterics, hermeticists in Victorian England, like John Dee, people like that. But in any case, the Orthodox Christians, the same people who burnt the Library of Alexandria, were studying the works of this pagan philosopher. Why? So there's more to Orthodoxy and Catholicism than meets the eye. You can see that as well, of course, in the history of the Medici. And why in the Vatican do they have all of these esoteric pagan artifacts, the pine cone, why is the audience chamber that the Pope speaks in today shaped like a snake's head? There's way more to Orthodox mainstream religion than I think we realize, and I think part of it is an intentional covering up of this ancient knowledge. So why did the conquistadors have to burn all the Aztec books? Maybe they were told to. Maybe that was part of the deal. You keep the gold, and you engage in this cover-up for the royal lines.
Which wouldn't have been a hard sell, because you're basically sending a bunch of bloodthirsty men and telling them to go slaughter and pillage. You don't even have to tell them it's part of a cover-up. Just tell them destroy everything, and they'll happily do it.
Yeah. I think, elite European and Near Eastern bloodlines have known about the existence of the New World for a long time. I mean, Plato obviously knew about the existence of North and South America. He talks about not only the island of Atlantis, but he says it was kind of a stepping stone to this vast continent surrounding the true ocean, the Atlantic. And geographically, that's the case. That's the fact. Plutarch testifies to the existence of the New World. This was known to a minority of these ancient elite families. Of course, Plato was at the top of the Athenian social elite. If anyone had inherited some of this esoteric knowledge, it would have been Plato. Athens was a Mycenaean site that didn't collapse. as well. So in the Bronze Age collapse, a lot of these settlements were destroyed and people scattered. Athens was one of the few places that was exempt, just like Egypt was exempt from the Bronze Age collapse. Assyria, not all of Assyria, but like certain settlements in Assyria maintained their traditions, and then they became this preeminent power in, you know, the 700s AD and stuff, or sorry, BC. So in any case, this knowledge of the New World, this knowledge of that Atlantean tradition and wisdom and whatever technologies the Atlanteans had access to, seems to have been this, I believe it is a secret that has been passed down in elite bloodlines for a very long time. And it makes you wonder when you look at like the genealogies of the American presidents, and all of them are related to the English royal family, including Obama, which...
Interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, and then there's also like in my own research in archaeology, and in many other fields, like in philosophy, I'll find, you know, I'm always kind of attuned to the Platonic influences, this kind of where I see the perennial, genuine philosophical truth or something that resonates. I'm like, okay, I have to target in on that and find out about this. And very often, when I find one of those trails in fringe field like archaeology, I'll hit these roadblocks, and I just know, like, they are occulting this knowledge. It is not accessible to me because it's exactly what I need to find out the truth here. Now, maybe that's like schizo posting at the moment, but like I think there is some awareness on the part of, you know, I don't know exactly who it is, if it's the European royal lines, if it's Hebraic lines, or some mixture, or, you know, who exactly constitutes this elite. I think they have an in-group identity that is totally esoteric and we don't know about. I've speculated that they kind of know that they're the Atlantean descendants, but they orchestrate research in various different fields on the basis of compartmentalization. And people think you can't have a conspiracy like this, but like, you know, the Manhattan Project didn't leak, and there were 40,000 people, 50,000 people working on it because of this compartmentalization. Not everyone knows the full picture, but you enforce these social norms so strongly, like the Clovis First doctrine in American archaeology. Like, you are just an outcast if you question this one specific narrative. And so you find that in like obscuring just those truths that are like most essential.
Yeah, just the paths that you would want to pursue in order to get closer to the truth. These all just happen to be the things that you're not allowed to research, that you will be shunned for if you do research. And or even persecuted, depending on what it is. And I think, you know, the fact that they push so hard, like every people needs a sort of like creation myth, right? Mm-hmm. And we sort of got a new creation myth out of the rubble of World War II. And that myth that we have now, this narrative that they sell us, is always, you know, science is best, linear progress, evolution. And why are they telling us that? Well, it obscures our origins, doesn't it? If you think that you evolved from a monkey, like, I mean, I know that's not the actual theory. Oh, we have a common ancestor with monkeys, whatever. You guys haven't found the common ancestor. Your whole theory of evolution hinges on this missing link for which there's no evidence. But we can't ask questions about the Clovis culture. We can't ask questions about, you know, the Bimini Road. Like, why? It doesn't make sense. It just, on its face, it raises a lot of red flags, and it benefits certain people more than the masses to have the masses believe in this myth of evolution and linear progress. As long as you believe in that, then nobody's going to ask these questions. And right. The people who do are just painted as, you know, conspiracy theorists or weirdos or tinfoil hat wearers, whatever. Mm-hmm. And to be fair, there are a lot of people like that in Atlantology types of circles. There are a lot of people who just lack discernment and get hung up on just really weird stuff that doesn't matter all that much, and then miss the bigger picture. And it's, you know, how many of those people are actually just like misinformation agents trying to distort the narrative and make it unattractive for anyone else to want to pursue these lines of questioning, because then you're lumped in with like the fruitcakes.
Yeah. Is that poisoning the well, or is that another rhetorical tactic? In any case, yeah, they do this in all sorts of topics. They themselves, or the flat Earth is one example of this. Like they put
flat
out,
Earth is another one of them.
yeah, the crazy in association with that like, you know, people who research 9/11. You'll find a handful of really detailed researchers giving their work, and then the video with 3 million views is just, you know, speculation based on a couple grainy images from videotapes, and they don't even look at the names of the people who were working in the you know, this sort of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, that makes me suspicious that there is some continuity going very, very far back into the past of this ruling elite. And I think they probably use the kinds of spiritual technologies that are indicated by someone like Plato. You know, the idea that when we die, we don't all... I forget the name of the river that we drink from that leads to our memory loss, but we don't all experience a similar...
The Lethean River?
I think so, yes. We don't all experience a similar degree of that memory loss. Now, you know, Y-DNA markers, I think, are an important part of how reincarnation occurs. That's my opinion. I think there are certain things about us that are the most salient. So that's our outward appearance, and then that's the kind of biological information that stores and specifies information about us that is recoverable in principle. Y-DNA has this huge store of information about, you know, our past and our relation to history. So if this kind of technology was known to an ancient group, reincarnation without memory loss, for example, if they, you know, understood how to breed within their groups to lead to the birth of particular historical individuals, you know, technology like that, you could summon a particular figure from your family line, perhaps, by, you know, matching these resonances. You know, we were around for tens of thousands of years, just going back to that, like, old school historical evolutionary perspective. We were around for tens of thousands of years without the kinds of modern technology that we have, and yet we had larger brains, or as large of brains as we have today. What did these people invest their energy in, and what were they researching? We assume that because they were still using stone tools, they were primitive. But, I mean,
But stone is built to last, and they had a view towards the eternal.
Right. Yes. So I think there, in more ways than one, they have a view towards the eternal, and I think a lot of their power is based on perhaps even establishing bridges. I mentioned those kind of adjacent worlds before, a finite number of adjacent worlds. Well, they may, in a sense, be pan-dimensional entities that are, you know, operating here as a social elite, but when they die, when they move between these worlds, they might be communicating some information, potentially. Again, I'm just going like full schizo mode because this video as a whole is kind of a schizo post, but I'm loving it, and it's kind of exciting, you know, to think about these things.
It is.
So that's probably as
we can
far...
do what we want. There's no rules.
Yeah.
We do what we want.
That's why I'm glad I'm not like in a university somewhere.
I know, right? Me too.
All right. So I think that's probably as far as we can reasonably push this in terms of speculation. Maybe we can kind of rein it back in a little bit. Now, just we can end with like, what do we think the moral lesson is ultimately here about Atlantis? What do we learn from Atlantis? We've already mentioned like the degeneration into materialism, etc. But like, is there any deeper meaning, you know, like that involves the ancient Athens? You know, ancient Athens stops this spread of the tyrannical Atlantis. So, you know, is there something to be gleaned from that? What is your overall like moral takeaway? What do we learn from the lesson of Atlantis?
Well, I mean, So Plato's basically saying the Atlanteans were descended from gods who lost their divine element by mixing with humans, or rather like the divine races, the initiated ones, mixed with the demonic races, the plebs. So you've got, in myth, you've got all these themes of like, you know, the Azir versus the Elementarvesen, who Serrano says were the slaves of Atlantis, or you get the Olympians versus the giants, the heroes versus monsters of darkness, or monsters of water and earth, or you get the Devas versus the Asura. So whenever you get basically human traits that are, you know, predominating over divine traits, and that's what all these myths speak to, is like the conquering of the human traits in order so that the divine can predominate. But when the human traits predominate, then we're no longer really able to live in line with the law from above. It just becomes too foreign to us. So if we ever want to return to Atlantis or any of these other like lost mythical civilizations, like all different names really for the same concept, spiritually speaking, if we want to return to that, we have to become the kind of people who can access that realm. So that's, you know, that's kind of one sort of spiritual lesson, but I think it's also important just because it teaches us something about human nature. Like even if the story has no historical evidence whatsoever, it still kind of has woven into it many aspects of human failure and human greatness. And it's kind of like a classic story that just seems to go right to the heart of some innate human tendency that when we fall, this is how it looks. It's intrinsic to being human, and a study of history just shows this repeating over and over again in different ways. But this idea that there was, you know, some ancient civilization that reached some kind of pinnacle of culture and science and transcendent meaning, and yet they still fell anyway. Like, that's a tremendous intellectual lesson for us, and our attempt to understand ourselves and the world at large as well. So it's just very important from that perspective. But also just because like it also just blows open the potential for human possibility as well.
Yeah, great thoughts. You know, Plato in the Republic describes a certain process of degeneration from the philosopher king to the kind of timocratic martial man, to the mercantile, to the democratic man, to ultimately like the tyrannical man. And I think there is this like characteristic process of degeneration that occurs at the level of like mass society and at the level of the individual. The one interesting thing I think about this story is that, and actually Proclus in his commentary on the Timaeus says this, like there is this symbolism of the celestial and the earthly. The Atlanteans represent this kind of manifold and an earthly force. Poseidon founds them from the top down, and there is this constant kind of descent and diversification with the Atlanteans. The Athenians, on the other hand, are founded by Athena, but not in a bodily sense. Like Poseidon bodily sires the kings of Atlantis. Athena guides the Gravettian noble race, if Mary Sedagast is correct, to begin exercising their intellects, ascending in their mind's eye to the archetypal ideal polity, and they instantiate it, and that, you know, they are maintained by this upward tension rather than this kind of downward imposition. So they're oriented in opposite directions, and they kind of represent like the two extremes that often meet geopolitically. And Athena, in her wisdom, founds this proto-Athens just when she needs to. There's some subtlety in the timeline that Plato gives between the Timaeus and the Critias. He seems to contradict himself because he says that ancient Athens was founded 9,600 BC. And then when talking about like the destruction of Atlantis, he talks about that in the Critias as seemingly also 9,600 BC. But I'm not even sure if he does contradict himself, and also the Critias wasn't finished. So if anything, we ought to go with the date from the Timaeus. But in any case, it looks, if you put the timelines together in a certain way, it looks like Athens was founded 9,600 BC, and then the war and the destruction happened 9,400 BC. People usually read it to say that the destruction happened 9,600 BC. But in any case, Athens may have been around for about 200 years, so just enough time to like come into its own, about the length of time that was required for like America to rise as a world power, so a reasonable time frame. And so she founds it just when the Athenians are needed to resist this kind of tyrannical onslaught. So that's the moral dimension that I'm more interested in. Like, we can learn from the story of Atlantis is like what to avoid, what not to do. But I'm really more interested in like, okay, what should we do to stop Atlantis? And Plato indicates very clearly what that ideal polity looks like. He goes at length in the Republic into this. How do we stem the tide of tyranny and illiberality and materialism? We already have that ideal archetype in our mind, and I mean, conveniently, we can just look to Plato's Republic to remind ourselves what that looks like. So that's been my hope, is maybe somewhere Athena will see fit to like inspire the founding of another proto-Athens. But that's my takeaway. So this has been really fun. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, it has been. Thank you. No, I think we've covered a ton. I mean, I'm sure we could probably keep talking for like 5 more hours or something, but I think we've covered all the main points.
Yeah, for sure. And it wasn't like a seamless video by any stretch, but yeah, we went in a lot of different directions, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So I appreciate you coming on, Philosophicat. Everyone check out her channel. Also, I started a Discord for Atlantology just so that there's a place. Just so that there's a place where people can post any links and books and things that they find on this topic. So I'll put the link to that Discord in the description. And I guess that's it then. I just love this topic so much. I want to keep talking about it, but we ought to end. It's been 2 hours. It's been fun. So thanks, everybody.
We can always have more conversations in the future. I've got some videos I'm working on for it. They're in the pipeline and just taking forever, but I am working on them, so I'll have some Atlantis content coming, hopefully soon.
All right,
soon, relatively soon, like on my timeline, soon could be like 6 months, but hopefully sooner than that.
Yeah, Philosophicat is good at a lot of things. Promptness maybe is not foremost among them, but yeah.
I always have like way too many things I'm working on simultaneously. So what tends to happen is that they all get done at the same time, but while I'm working on them all, it seems like I'm doing nothing.
Right, but we appreciate it when we get the content. So everyone, go subscribe to our channel if you're not already. Thanks everyone for listening. Take care.